Hello, thank you for joining us today. My name is Kristina Wyckoff. I am the Section 106 Coordinator and Historical Archaeologist at the Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office. And this presentation in the Oklahoma SHPO Winter Workshop Series is Archaeological Investigations and Site Evaluations. So the goal of this presentation is to emphasize how critical it is to organize investigations and documentation around a research design, and that this applies to any type of archaeological investigation, from a survey of a well pad or a cell tower site being submitted under 106 to a large-scale thematic survey or data recovery project. I'm also going to emphasize that it's important to discuss archaeological sites using the appropriate historic context, to consider the potential applicability of a site under each of the 4 criteria, and always to address significance and integrity. A quick overview. I'm going to be looking at National Park Service guidance for identification standards, talking about research designs, talking about archaeological investigations and documentation guidance for Oklahoma, and then National Park Service guidance for evaluating archaeological sites for National Register eligibility, or guidance from the National Register Bulletin 36. So I'm going to begin by looking at the National Park Service guidance for identification standards. The Park Service provides 3 identification standards, and they emphasize that the purpose of identification activities is to gather information. The scope of identification activities depends on existing knowledge about properties, goals for survey activities developed during the planning process, and current management needs. The first standard is identification of historic properties is undertaken to the degree required to make decisions. The gathered information should provide a sound basis for the decisions to be made. Archival research and survey activities should be designed to gather information needed for the preservation goals. Objectives, methods, and techniques, and expected results are specified in a research design, and activities may include archival research, for instance, to develop historic contexts, sampling to understand the kinds of properties present, examination of every property in an area as a basis for property-specific decisions. And then identification efforts should be consistent with the management needs and the character of the investigated area. The second standard is the results of identification activities are integrated into the preservation planning process. Ensure the planning process is always based on the best available information. And that's how we do it, by enacting this standard. Results of identification activities are reviewed for their effects on previous planning data. The third standard is identification activities include explicit procedures for record keeping and information distribution. For gathered information to be useful in other preservation activities, it must be systematically gathered and recorded and made available to those responsible for preservation planning. Looking at the Park Service's guidance for archaeological documentation. Archaeological documentation consists of activities including archival research, observation and recording of above ground and below ground remains, including excavation and remote sensing. Archaeological documentation is employed for the purpose of gathering information on historic properties. It's guided by a framework of objectives and methods, which is derived from the planning process. And it makes use of previous planning decisions, including evaluations of significance. And care should be taken to assure documentation efforts do not duplicate previous efforts. Standard 1, under the Archaeological Documentation Standards, says archaeological documentation activities follow an explicit statement of objectives and methods that responds to needs identified in the planning process. This may be undertaken to fulfill different needs, for instance, overviews and background studies, or data recovery to mitigate adverse effects. Planning needs are articulated in a statement of objectives. The statement guides the selection of the methods and provides comparative framework for evaluation and evaluating alternatives. Satisfactory documentation involves archaeological and historic sources, as well as other disciplines. The statement of objectives is usually a formal research design drawn from planning needs, current knowledge, resource value, and logistics. The second standard of the archaeological documentation is the methods and techniques of archaeological documentation are selected to obtain the information required by the statement of objectives. The chosen methods should be the most effective, least destructive, most efficient, and economical means of obtaining the information. So you're having to balance all of these different ideas to find the best methods to meet the needs of the project. Methods and techniques should be selected so that the results can be verified. Non-destructive techniques should be used whenever appropriate. And a focus on stated objectives throughout the process of study and documentation is the goal. The third standard is the results of archaeological documentation are assessed against the statement of objectives and integrated into the planning process. Products of your archaeological documentation are your recovered data, but also information about the usefulness of your statement of objectives. How well did the recovered data meet your planning needs? You need to integrate the results into planning, for instance, identification and evaluation of properties. The results of data analyses are integrated into the body of current knowledge. And you need to assess the usefulness of the methods and techniques you employed so that future documentation efforts can be modified to improve them, to take advantage of what you learned. The fourth standard says the results of archaeological documentation are reported and made available to the public. The results can be accessible to a range of users, which could include agencies, the professional community, and the public. The way that that information is provided and the degree to which the information is provided to those different groups may vary. Reports should summarize objectives, methods, techniques, and the results, and also identify the repository for the information. Where can other researchers go to follow up and to confirm the efforts of the results of your findings? Translate the information gained for the public. Communicate what you've learned in a way that's appropriate for the public to understand, and also that will still protect the resource. And find appropriate ways to share that information to meet the public where they are. The goal of dissemination, according to the NPS guidance, should be balance and should protect sensitive information when disclosure might result in damage to an archaeological resource. Also, it's important that curation arrangements sufficient to preserve artifacts, specimens, and records are provided. Okay, so now I'm just going to transition to talking about research design, which is really largely related to all of this information the National Park Service has provided, recommending documentation standards. A research design should integrate the historic context and the methodology. Consider in your research design the nature of your project and federal involvement, and details should match the size and complexity of the project. So if your project is a small project and very limited in scope, maybe you wouldn't be going into the same degree of detail um, and background as you would, expansive background as you would with a larger project. Information should always be directly relevant to the project area. Everything needs to be connected. Um, the National Park Service Identification Standard 1, identification of historic properties is undertaken to the degree required to make decisions. So remember, you are looking at your goals and you're looking at the project and making sure that the work you're doing is meeting those goals and is recognizing the properties you know exist, the environment you're working in, etc. The project area or your area of potential effect, you're looking at previously identified resources and historic properties in the APE or the project area and the vicinity. And you're also considering the limitations of any previous investigations, or maybe that there have been no previous investigations in the immediate area of your project to give you clues about where you would expect to find resources. Research design establishes the goals and directions for your research. Identification efforts are essentially research activities. The statement of objectives or the research design should be prepared before your work is performed. So you have your theory that you're putting into practice. Your research design helps you to think about the project, what your goals are, and how you're going to hopefully achieve them. The research design stipulates the logical integration of historic context and field and laboratory methodology. So how is the historic context of your project area going to, and how does it inform the field and lab methods that you're proposing? These are most valuable when they relate to defined goals and to one another. The research design provides focus for the integration of interdisciplinary information. You're pulling in how other disciplines, information from other disciplines are relevant to this work. And ensure that linkages between specialized activities are real, logical, and address the defined research questions. Everything you're doing is to address the research questions, address the objectives of the identification standard. You're looking to make sure that the work you're doing matters in a way that makes sense and then can be confirmed. Identification activities should be guided by the research designs, and the results should be discussed in those terms. So you're communicating what your goals are, how your work is supposed to accomplish those goals, and then you're communicating your results and how they did or didn't meet the goals. The research design should include objectives of identification activities, number one. For example, characterize the range of historic properties in a region, or identify the number of properties associated within a context, or gather information to determine which properties in an area are significant. You want to refer to current knowledge about the historic contexts or property types. This is based on background research or assessment of previous research. You need to clearly define the physical extent of the area to be investigated and the amount and kinds of information to be gathered about properties in the area. This should include methods to be, the research design, in addition to one, objectives of identification activities, needs to include two, the methods that you're going to use. This will include both archival research and field survey. Your research material should be clearly and specifically related to research problems. You need to communicate how the information was obtained and the possible limitations or biases. Again, this is very similar to what we just talked about in the National Park Service's identification standards. We want to communicate how we learned what we learned and what the limits of our work are. Methods should be compatible with the past and present environmental character of the geographic area and the kinds of properties most likely to be present in that area. So, 1, objectives of identification activities. 2, methods to be used. 3, expected results and the reason for those expectations. So the third part of the research design, you want to talk about the expectations about the kind, number, or location, character, condition of historic properties. And these are generally based on a combination of your background research, proposed hypotheses, and an analogy to kinds of properties that you know exist in areas of similar environment or history. You also need an environmental context and a historic context. The environmental context provides descriptions of the area's physical environment, and these are scaled to the area of the undertaking and the potential role of the environment in understanding archaeological resources that may be present there. The study should tie in directly with the research design and cultural significance. It's all connected. Make sure you show that it's all connected. The historic context, or the cultural setting for pre-contact and post-contact, is an organizational framework of information based on theme, geographic area, and period of time. Recommended as a basis for organizing information pertinent to the research design and the survey results. A survey may focus on a single or several historic contexts and may identify properties relating to a single or multiple property types depending on the goals of the survey, the objectives, what the preservation needs are. Historic contexts may be based on the physical development and character, trends, and major events or important individuals and groups that occurred at various times in the history of a community or other geographical unit. So thinking about research design, to using a research design to address those National Park Service standards, to think about your project, think about the needs and how you're going to accomplish them. Let's talk about the archaeological investigations. Pre-field research. Investigations must begin with a review of known information. What do we already know? Information on sites, structures, and studies that are already on record. This will guide the archaeological work to follow. So you need to look at the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey's site files, surveys, and reports to see what archaeological work has already been done, what sites have already been identified and are known. You also need to look at the Oklahoma Landmarks Inventory to see what built environment properties have already been identified, the Centennial Farm and Ranch records to see what known long-term occupations are present in the area of your project, and Oklahoma's National Register of Historic Places listings to see known historically significant resources in your project area or in the vicinity. You also need to be looking at maps, including BLM, the Bureau of Land Management's General Land Office maps and historical aerial photographs. You also need to be looking at other historical maps you can access depending on what you find. You may be looking more at early maps, early topographic maps, or maybe you need to be looking more at transportation maps that are more recent. We'll show you developments in the area in the more recent past or the earlier past. So then I'm going to transition to fieldwork. We're going to talk about we're going to talk about reconnaissance surveys and intensive surveys. A reconnaissance survey is designed to gain a general idea of the archaeological potential of portions of the project area. This might be a walkover archaeological inspection where you're walking across the land and performing small-scale investigations or shovel tests, perhaps. You're going to, if you're doing this type of a survey, you're going to make sure that you're studying maps and aerials, soil surveys, etc., so you understand the project area, the layout, and the environment throughout the history of that area. So you know where you're looking and what you might be looking for, and all of this is discussed in your research design. Your data should allow for predictions of further identification work. The data that you are acquiring through this reconnaissance survey should allow for predictions of further identification work and for setting priorities for individual tasks involved. And in many cases, this reconnaissance survey may not be sufficient for the entire project needs. Resurvey may be required if complete information is needed about specific properties. Reconnaissance survey should document, and this will look familiar when we go to the next one, the kinds of properties that you're looking for, the boundaries of your survey area, your methods, the kinds of historic properties present in the surveyed area, specific properties that were not identified, and the categories of information collected, and places examined that did not contain historic properties. And so switching from reconnaissance survey to an intensive survey, an intensive survey is designed to identify all historic resources in the area. It involves detailed background research and a thorough inspection and documentation of all historic properties in the field. It permits the classification of individual properties and records the physical extent of specific properties. It should produce all the information needed to evaluate historic properties and to prepare an inventory. And so intensive surveys should document the kinds of properties you were looking for, the boundaries of the area you surveyed, your methods. It should record the precise location of all properties identified and should provide information on the appearance, significance, integrity, and boundaries of each property sufficient to permit an evaluation of significance of that property. I'm not going to go through all of fact sheet 16 and spell out each of these steps in the report. You can reference that document yourselves. I've attached it to the handouts and it's available on our website. However, I will list the different report components that we request be included in any archaeological survey report submitted to the Oklahoma State Historic Preservation Office and the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey as a requirement of 106 consultation or other purposes. This would include a title page, table of contents, an abstract, introduction, research design, environmental setting, cultural setting, just as we've discussed, pre-field research, fieldwork, recommendations for the cultural resources, archaeological resources. What did you find? Describe those archaeological resources. Interpretive conclusions of your studies, recommendations for cultural resource management and future research, and any appropriate appendices to include site forms, maps that wouldn't be public record, etc., and bibliography. I will jump back to number 11 on our list of requirements, archaeological resources. Please note that documentation of historic sites that may include extant or non-extant homestead structures and other related features, such as trash dumps and features related to agricultural or ranching activities, should include a history of the property ownership, which could include a review of the chain of title, also a review of those individuals on the chain of title for whether they may be notable at a local or regional or state, etc. level, a review of historic maps and aerials that depict the occupation of the site throughout time. And all of these reviews have to be communicated in your documentation. So it's not enough that you looked at it, you have to show your work. At this point, I am going to transition from archaeological evaluation or investigations to evaluations of sites. So this portion of the presentation focuses on the National Park Service National Register Bulletin 36 guidance for evaluating archaeological properties. Historic contexts provide a basis for judging a property's significance and integrity. And a historic context is the pattern, themes, trends in history by which a specific occurrence, property, or site can be understood, and its historic meaning and significance can be made clear. So that's why it's critical to have a historic context when you're evaluating the significance of an archaeological site. Factors influencing which contexts are the most important in evaluating an archaeological property include property type, the data sets or archaeological patterns represented, the region and time of occupation, the role of the property in historical development of the jurisdiction, state, and region, and the role of the property in America's history, and information in the State Historic Preservation Plan. Only the contexts that are important to understanding and justifying the significance of the property must be discussed. So there will certainly be many different historic contexts available for comparison to a site. Just like everything earlier in the presentation, all of the parts need to be connected and the connections need to be communicated. So show the historic contexts that are relevant to understanding the importance of a site. The evaluation uses the historic context as the framework within which to apply the criteria for evaluation to a specific property or to property types. Creating a historic context. To create a historic context, you need to identify the concept, the time period, and the geographic limits for the historic context you're creating. You need to assemble the existing information about the historic context and synthesize that information, make sense of it. Then provide property types and identify further information needs. So all of this helps you understand the knowns and you'll be able to communicate how the property that you are, the historic or the archaeological site that you're evaluating fits into the known context. So here's an example that I took directly out of the National Register Bulletin 36. This example discusses an archaeological site. It's a well-preserved ruin of an 18th century sugar factory, directly linked to the chartering and early economic development of a town. The ruins are the only surviving sugar factory ruins that illustrate this region's early maritime and international trade activities. And they provide some additional information. 100 years after it was abandoned, it was used for a short period by a state militia and had no other uses. So the Park Service tells us to illustrate the sugar factory's significance, we need to discuss the establishment and the early economic development of this town and the maritime and international trade activities of the region at the time this factory was operational. The association of the factory with these activities and the technology of sugar production also has to be addressed. However, assuming no other historical association with this militia stay, the Park Service tells us it's unlikely that an archaeological survey of this property is going to give us significant information relating to the state's military history. So we will not need to discuss a historic context of this militia in association with the property. They do note that if the militia unit has a bearing on the integrity of the property, so while the militia were at this property, they impacted some of the resources, perhaps some of the features in a way that changed the integrity, then that needs to be discussed. Okay, so now we'll go through each of the criteria. looking at the National Register Bulletin and thinking about how you consider each of these criterion of significance for archaeological properties. So criterion A, one, you need to identify the event. So we're talking about importance because of an association. Identify the event or events with which the property, this archaeological site we've identified, is associated. Two, we need to document the importance of that event or events within the broad pattern of history, and then demonstrate the strength of association of the property to those events, and assess the integrity of the property. So we're doing all of these first three steps before we get to integrity. Keep in mind, we're looking at significance and we're looking at integrity, but we're not conflating them. They are two separate questions we're addressing. Under criterion A, an archaeological site must have well-preserved features, artifacts, and intrasite patterning in order to illustrate a specific event or pattern of event in history. We'll move to criterion B. Very similar to A, we're going to identify, in this case, the important person associated with the property. We're going to discuss the property, that significant person's importance within the relevant historic context. And we're going to demonstrate the strength of association between that person and this archaeological site. And then we will assess the integrity of the property. Under criterion B, sufficient integrity implies that the essential physical features during the property's association with this person of significance with their life are intact. So resources that communicate this individual of significance are intact in this archaeological property. And if the property is a site that had no material culture remains, but is significant for its association with this person, then the setting must be intact. Archaeological properties need to be in good condition with excellent preservation of features, artifacts, and spatial relationships to be eligible under criterion B. Criterion C. Under criterion C, when evaluating an archaeological site, we need to identify the distinctive characteristics of type, period, method of construction, master, craftsman, or high artistic value of this archaeological resource. We need to discuss the importance of the property given the relevant historic context and the applicability of criterion C. We need to evaluate how strongly the property illustrates the distinctive characteristics of the type, period, or method of construction, master, craftsman, or high artistic value. And then we address the integrity of the property. Under criterion C, distinctive characteristics can be illustrated in one or more ways. They can be illustrated in a pattern of features that's common to a particular class of resources, such as a sugar mill with associated archaeological remains representing 18th century Caribbean sugar mills, or individuality or variation of features that occurs within a class. For instance, the well-preserved ruins of an 1860s brewery designed and built to produce a particular type of ale. Or the evolution of a class over time, the transition between classes of resources, for instance, the well-preserved sites of 4 adjacent shipyards, each representing a different time period in clipper shipbuilding. So we're showing this transition from one type to another over time. To meet the integrity requirement of criterion C, an archaeological property must have remains that are well preserved and clearly illustrate the design and construction of a building or structure. So now we'll go to criterion D, which we're all, of course, familiar with, with archaeological sites. Under criterion D, we need to identify the property's data sets or categories of archaeological, historical, or ecological information. We need to identify the historic context that is the appropriate historical and archaeological framework to evaluate this property. And we need to identify the important research questions that the property's data sets can be expected to address. Taking archaeological integrity into consideration, we need to evaluate the data sets in terms of their potential and known ability to answer research questions. And we need to identify the important information that an archaeological study of the property has yielded or is likely to yield. Because to be eligible under Criterion D, the property must have or have had information that can contribute to our understanding of human history, but the information must also be important. So we have to demonstrate those research questions or the information, why it is communicating important information to history or prehistory, to our understanding of the human past. And that is the information that I am sharing with you in this presentation. In closing, I want to reiterate those thoughts that I provided at the beginning. We want to make sure that we're discussing archaeological sites using the appropriate historic contexts, that we're considering the potential applicability of each criteria, and that we always address significance and integrity, both significance and integrity in assessing archaeological sites, acknowledging that an archaeological resource must have both significance and integrity in order to be eligible for the National Register. It is critical to organize all of our investigations and documentation around a research design, and this applies to any type of archaeological investigation, from the smallest to the most expansive. We want to make sure that our thoughts about the project are dictating the work that we do, and that the results of our work, we're communicating that back, we're circling that back so that future work can take into account what we've learned. Everything in your documentation, everything in your report needs to tie together. So make all of the connections explicit as you're documenting your environmental background for a particular county. Maybe you're taking some boilerplate language that you use that is relevant to a particular county in Oklahoma for the work you're doing. Fine, but take that information and tie it to this project. Explain why the information about this county's environmental background is relevant to the work that you're doing here in this particular case. Same with your historical context. The same with your methods. Why are these methods appropriate for this project? How are they part of your design? What is your goal? So hopefully all of this information, which I know you've all seen before, will be helpful to you going forward. And thank you so much for attending this presentation. I appreciate you being here.